Good morning, everyone. My topic is about communicating effectively, everybody's job. Clearly, communication skills are a necessary component of healthy relationships. Lack of such ability is also a sign of relationships that are having trouble. This holds true for all kinds of connections, but it is especially important for strong school community relations. When there are issues with school community relations, a communication breakdown is typically the main cause rather than any other factor. In other words, the majority of school administrators are aware of the significance of developing and keeping strong bonds with all key stakeholders. They frequently miss the fact that communication is a complex skill. Examining the various steps involved in communication is necessary to comprehend why this is the case. Effective communication depends on each of these steps. Miscommunication can and often does result from a breakdown in any one of them. Let me first give a brief overview of the lesson goals before I get into my topic in detail. One is to discuss the processes of and barriers to communication. Two is determine ways on how to overcome the communication barriers. And three is to share one's perspective on the significance of effective communication in school community relations. Public hearings are great places to practice your communication skills. Hearings are about listening, and people want no less the opportunity to be heard than the actual chance to speak. Hearings are not places to argue with presenters. It is their turn to talk, and they expect the Board of Administration to look like they are interested in their ideas. Public hearings are seldom places where decisions are made, but they are always places where public perceptions are forged. We frequently participate in public forums, meetings, and conferences, both inside and outside of school, where we can express and share our thoughts. We also establish connections with other people so that we can be understood and make wise decisions when judgment is required to address difficulties and concerns at school. Now, let me share with you an experience I had last April when my coworkers and I participated in a team building activity. So, one of the activities was playing a communication game where teachers had to give a message to someone else who then passed the message on to a third person. It became a little distorted as the game went on and the message was passed from one player to the next. The message changed significantly from the beginning of the game until its conclusion. Communication can be challenging, as we have learned, and the best way to understand communication, which is too frequently seen as a single act, is as a multifaceted process. Communication process is not complex because it challenges our cognitive abilities. Rather, it gains its complexity by virtue of the significance of each individual step. A problem with any one of the steps can lead to devastating outcomes. In reality, communication has four processes: the idea formation, idea encoding, communication channel, and receiver decoding. Idea formation is the first step in the communication process. This step is largely internal and involves only the constitution of the speaker. It is at this initial stage of communication that the speaker generates idea that he or she intends to communicate. An example of idea formation would be choosing to hold a general parents meeting to discuss the do's and don'ts of doing in-person classes. When the principal started considering the start of face-to-face classes, an idea was born. In this case, the principal considered strategies for teaching in the new normal based on his or her first-hand knowledge of health and safety regulations. Now, the next in the communication process is idea encoding. Idea encoding is the process by which the idea is put into language, words, and symbols that is appropriate for conveying the intended message. This process is mainly internal. It is therefore impossible to think of any issue with this procedure. However, the reality is that idea encoding lies at the heart of many communication issues. In our previous example, the principal has a wide range of alternatives for encoding the idea of choosing to hold a general parents meeting for the start of face-to-face classes. When communicating an idea verbally, choices must be taken about the language use, vocal tone, and body language. Although body language is no longer a problem when communicating ideas in writing, there is still a lot of focus on the words that are written. I have here other examples of how idea could have been encoded. Without knowing the biases of the faculty these messages were intended for, and consider how you would receive the two of them. Staff, it has come to my attention that the annual Stone Creek Open House has been scheduled between the hours of 4 and 6 p.m. This strikes me as a bit absurd. If we truly want Open House to provide parents with an opportunity to visit our school and learn of our goals, then we must schedule it at a more convenient time. Therefore, this year's Open House will begin at 6 p.m. and conclude at 8 p.m. Staff, in keeping with our goals and of welcoming parents and of being sensitive to their needs, I think we need to re-examine our Stone Creek Open House schedule. My understanding is that this annual event has traditionally been held between the hours of 4 and 6 p.m. Given the demanding work schedules of many of our parents, I believe that we could be most accommodating if we held this year's event from 6 p.m. until 8 p.m. Your feedback, as always, is most welcome. The intended message in both of these examples is the same. In fact, there are a few variations between them. Which would you receive more positively, though? Which one is more inclusive and appears more welcoming? The way in which an idea is encoded is vitally important to the success of any communication process. The method by which an individual communicates an idea is referred to as the communication channel. Now, in the example of holding a general parents' meeting, the message could be delivered in writing, which would clearly allow only one-way communication. The message could also be delivered verbally, maybe at a faculty meeting. This two-way communication would give others an opportunity to give an immediate response, which would inform the principal of the accuracy and merit of the original idea. The concept of a communication channel implies the timeliness of communication as well. At one school with which I am familiar, there is a communication notebook beside the staff sign-in sheet. The communication notebook is used to staff members to share written reminders, commendations, thank yous, questions, jokes, announcements, and updates for the entire staff to read. The notebook has been an invaluable tool for positive communication within this particular school building. It is the only vehicle that can be used by all staff members, and it ensures that everyone will see the information at least first thing in the morning and at the end of the day. Ideas such as this can become lasting parts of school's culture and can provide a positive forum in which people can share. The final step in the communication process is called receiver decoding. At this point, the responsibility for communication has temporarily shifted from the individual who originated the thought to the person who is receiving the information. It is at this stage that problems are encountered time and time again. If you have ever been in a situation where you thought you said one thing but people heard something different, then you may have experienced a breakdown in receiver decoding. Now my question is, what practice or practices do you have at your school that facilitate effective communication? This time, let's talk about nonverbal communication. We communicate so many of our ideas without even saying a word. Our nonverbal communication often is far more powerful than our verbal communication. So now, I have a number of examples of how nonverbal communication can be understood or interpreted. When people are feeling nervous, they are often likely to clear their throat, avoid eye contact, perspire, fidget, speak faster than normal, swallow frequently, bite their nails, rapidly move their leg up and down. When people are feeling annoyed or frustrated, they are often likely to clench their hands, clench their jaw, breathe deeply and exhale forcefully, place their hands on their hips, shake their head from side to side. When people are feeling insecure around somebody, they are often likely to avoid eye contact, bite their nails, place their hands in their pockets, tug at their clothing. When people are feeling confident, they are often likely to exhibit good posture, sit back their chair, clasp their hands behind their back, make frequent eye contact, rest their hands comfortably on a desk or table. There are much more chances for miscommunication because there are so many processes involved in effective communication. Communication barriers aren't always brought on by misinterpretation of nonverbal cues. They're also not always the result of communication breakdowns. Instead, there are other communication barriers that school administrators need to be aware of. Many of the problems of misunderstanding can be cured by understanding these barriers and being aware of them when they arise. So these are the different communication barriers: language barriers, cultural barriers, barriers inherent in specific physical disabilities, and barriers related to time. Let me discuss all these in detail. Language barriers occurs when two people who speak different languages cannot understand one another, and there is a breakdown in language and communication. School leaders ought to closely examine whether or not the personnel is in place to facilitate communication with stakeholders who are not proficient in English. Beyond that, the best school leader, in recognition of their community role, are well served to make themselves more skilled at communication with people in languages other than English. For example, my principal often advised me to speak in a language that parents could understand and would find comfortable to listen during meetings, which is a good example of the language barriers I personally experience. Even though I don't think most of the parents at our school don't know English, I do think that using Rinconada would make them feel more at ease and welcome. The next barrier to communication is the cultural barriers. It occurs mainly when communication happens between two different cultural backgrounds. It is imperative that school administrators recognize the different cultural interpretations of body language and space. The cultural differences must be appreciated so that school leaders do not misinterpret people. Otherwise, unnecessary barriers to effective communications are created. Often forgotten and frequently underrepresented are those stakeholders with physical disabilities. Physical disabilities such as hearing problems or speech difficulties are physical barriers to communication. Not being able to see the nonverbal cues, gestures, posture, and general body language can make communication less effective. Dependent upon limitations of the individual, their communication requirements may be the same as individuals without disabilities or may be profoundly different. School personnel, particularly the leaders, must be sensitive to these differences. The next barrier is barrier related to time. Communication takes time. Too often, school leaders are unable or unwilling to devote their time necessary for proper communication. This failure leads to criticisms that question the concerned commitment and fairness of a leader. Time-related issues lead to a great communication paradox. Taking the time to communicate purposefully and carefully in the beginning saves time in the long run. Now I have a question. Could you describe a time when you came up against one of these barriers to communication when interacting with others in your school community? So, how can we get beyond these barriers to communication? In fact, there are methods that, when used correctly, can significantly reduce many of the more typical communication barriers we all encounter. These are perception checking, communicating regularly, and communicating purposefully. Using the skill of perception checking requires that you ask the person you are communicating with whether or not you are correctly perceiving his or her feelings. It does not imply any judgment of these feelings, but rather affords you an opportunity to see whether you have perceived them correctly. For example, you might ask a person who crossed his arms while you are talking. It would sound something like this: I noticed that you are crossing your arms. Are you happy with something I said? And maybe his reply would be simply, No, I'm just cold. A misunderstanding of actions or behavior may have resulted from a failure to use perception checking. Communication that occurs with regular pattern can become predictable. This predictability is often helpful as people come to expect it and consequently are ready to receive it. If an individual can rely on receiving some positive communication on a regular basis, then he will look more favorable anticipation on any communication that he receives. Basically, the individual will receive the communication with the anticipation that it will be positive. Consider this example. You are principal of Fabrica Elementary School. It has long been a practice in your school to communicate often with parents. This communication comes from teachers, support staff, and the main office, and it occurs when good things happen as well as when bad things occur. Your staff sends notes touting positive student behaviors, make 5 positive telephone calls per week, and host a monthly tea for all parents whose children had been caught being good during that month. Purposeful communication allows leaders to think through the reason for the communication, the best method of communication, and the eventual resolution of the discussion. In all cases, teacher staff members and parents appreciated the fact that the principal communicated regularly and that this communication had a clearly understood purpose. We can actually relate this case study analysis to my topic on effective communication. All the news that fits to print, and then some. Maria Rodriguez was highly respected for her leadership skills and her dedication to school improvement. During the 6 years in which she had been principal of Lincoln High School, the student body had experienced steady gains on standardized assessments, and parent and community support had strengthened. By most measures, Maria was an outstanding high school principal. The day after this year's standardized achievement test results were released to the local press, Maria got an unexpected visit from a newspaper reporter who was new to the local paper. Not being very experienced, he sat down nervously in Maria's office and began asking her questions about the school's assessment results. As the conversation progressed, the reporter fidgeted in his seat, dropped his pencil several times, and was perspiring profusely. The situation was compounded by the frequent interruptions on the telephone and with discipline referrals arriving at Maria's office. After about 30 minutes and countless interruptions, the two ended their conversation and the reporter left the school building to begin writing his story. Maria Rodriguez was furious when she read the front page story in the New Morning's newspaper. Several facts about the school's test performance were misinterpreted, and Maria felt that many of her comments were taken out of context and made her appearance apathetic to the importance of good test results. She vowed never to speak with that incompetent reporter again and began plotting how she would explain the misinterpretation in this newspaper story to his superintendent. Now, my question is, what effect, if any, did nonverbal communication have on the conversation between Maria Rodriguez and the reporter? Were there any steps that Maria could have taken to reduce communication barriers that were present? For the synthesis of my report, one of the most important aspects of positive, successful relationships is the ability to communicate effectively. There are many steps to communication process. Failure of errors in any of these steps can result in a communication breakdown. We communicate a great deal through nonverbal means. Therefore, the ability to understand our own nonverbal idiosyncrasies becomes vitally important. Perceptions checking is a skill that allows us to ascertain the extent to which we are successfully reading another person's nonverbal messages. We are increasingly finding native languages to be a barrier to effective communication. Other barriers such as cultural issues and physical disabilities must be understood as we evaluate our communication plans. Through thoughtful, intentional efforts, communication barriers can be overcome.